The year was 1952, and the Korean War was tearing through the mountains like a razor blade through flesh. Captain James Mitchell stood in the freezing rain at Firebase Echo, somewhere along the 38th parallel, watching his men huddle around barrel fires trying to stay warm. At 32 years old, Mitchell was already a decorated officer with a Distinguished Service Cross from World War II, but nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for what he was about to face. His unit, Charlie Company of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, had been holding this position for 17 brutal days. The firebase sat on a strategic ridge overlooking a valley that both sides desperately wanted to control. Mitchell's orders were simple on paper but impossible in practice: hold the position at all costs until reinforcements arrived. The problem was that reinforcements were already 3 days late. His men were running dangerously low on ammunition, and intelligence reports suggested that a massive enemy offensive was coming within hours. Mitchell walked among his troops that evening, seeing exhaustion carved into faces that belonged to men barely out of their teenage years. Private Danny Rodriguez from Texas kept checking his rifle compulsively, his hands shaking from something that wasn't just the cold. Sergeant Bill Thompson from Ohio, a veteran who'd fought alongside Mitchell in France, sat quietly sharpening his knife with mechanical precision. Corporal Mike Sullivan from Boston wrote letters home he probably wouldn't get to send. These weren't just soldiers under Mitchell's command. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. Every single one of them trusted him to bring them home alive. As darkness fell over Firebase Echo, the intelligence officer, Lieutenant Chen, pulled Mitchell aside with news that made his blood run cold. Radio intercepts confirmed what they'd feared. A full battalion, maybe 1,500 enemy soldiers, was moving toward their position. Mitchell's company had been reduced to just 87 combat-ready men after weeks of constant skirmishing. The math was simple and terrifying. They were outnumbered more than 17 to 1. Mitchell studied the maps spread across the makeshift command table inside his bunker. The firebase occupied high ground, which gave them a tactical advantage, but their ammunition situation was critical. Each man had maybe 2 magazines left for their rifles. They had 3 mortars with less than 20 shells total. The machine gun nests were down to their last belts. In a sustained firefight against overwhelming numbers, they'd run dry within an hour. Mitchell had 3 options, and he hated all of them. First, he could follow his orders literally and hold the position no matter what, which would almost certainly result in his entire company being wiped out. Second, he could retreat without authorization, saving his men but abandoning a strategic position and facing a court-martial for disobeying direct orders. Third, there was something else, something that no military manual covered, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mitchell called his senior NCOs together just after midnight. Sergeant Thompson, Sergeant First Class Martinez from New Mexico, and Staff Sergeant Johnson from Georgia gathered around the flickering oil lamp. Mitchell laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Martinez asked the question everyone was thinking: what were they going to do? Mitchell's answer would change everything. Mitchell revealed a plan so unconventional, so outside standard military doctrine, that his sergeants initially thought he was joking. 6 miles to the northeast, intelligence had identified an enemy supply depot that was lightly guarded. Mitchell proposed something audacious. Instead of waiting to be overrun, they would take 40 of their best men, leave the rest to defend the firebase, and conduct a lightning raid on that depot. But this wasn't about destroying supplies. Mitchell had learned that the depot contained ammunition, weapons, and crucially medical supplies that his wounded men desperately needed. The real genius and the real controversy of his plan was what came next. If they could capture enough enemy ammunition, they could actually resupply their own position using the enemy's resources against them. It was unorthodox, risky, and possibly brilliant. Thompson immediately saw the problem. They'd be splitting their already small force, making both groups vulnerable. Martinez pointed out that using enemy ammunition could lead to confusion in battle, friendly fire incidents, and violations of military protocol. Johnson reminded everyone that leaving the firebase to conduct an unauthorized raid could be seen as desertion or dereliction of duty. Mitchell knew they were all right. This wasn't a decision made lightly. He'd spent hours wrestling with it, thinking through every angle, every consequence, but he'd also done the cold calculation. If they stayed put and fought conventionally, casualties would be catastrophic. If they retreated, they'd be abandoning their mission. This third option, crazy as it sounded, actually gave them a fighting chance. Not just to survive, but to accomplish their mission and bring everyone home. At 0200 hours, Mitchell assembled his raiding party. He picked volunteers only, making sure everyone understood the risks. 43 men stepped forward. Mitchell had to turn 6 away, needing them for the firebase defense. The men he chose were a cross-section of American courage. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California who'd put their lives on hold to serve. As they blackened their faces with mud and checked their weapons one final time, nobody spoke about the possibility they might not come back. The raid began in silence. Mitchell's team moved through the Korean wilderness like ghosts, using every bit of cover the mountainous terrain provided. The temperature had dropped below freezing, turning their breath into visible clouds they had to consciously control. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Every distant sound could be an enemy patrol. They moved in a tactical formation that Mitchell had perfected during his time in Europe, each man knowing instinctively where the others were without having to look. After 2 hours of careful movement, they reached a ridge overlooking the supply depot. What they saw made their hearts sink. Intelligence had been wrong about it being lightly guarded. Mitchell counted at least 60 enemy soldiers, maybe more, moving around the facility. The depot itself was larger than reported, a collection of wooden buildings and storage bunkers surrounded by sandbags and machine gun positions. This wasn't a lightly defended supply point. This was a major logistics hub. Thompson crawled up next to Mitchell, and their eyes met in the darkness. The silent question hung between them. Do we abort? Mitchell studied the layout for 10 minutes that felt like hours. He noticed something. Most of the guards were concentrated on the south side, the direction any conventional attack would come from. The north side, backed against a steep hillside, had minimal security. They'd assumed the terrain made that approach impossible. Mitchell smiled grimly. They were about to prove that assumption wrong. He divided his force into 3 groups. Thompson would take 15 men and create a diversion on the east side, drawing guards away from the main depot. Martinez would lead 10 men to secure the perimeter and prevent reinforcements. Mitchell himself would take the remaining 18 directly into the depot from that impossible north side. It was a plan that required split-second timing, absolute courage, and more than a little luck. At 0430 hours, Thompson's diversion team opened fire. The crack of rifles shattered the night, and immediately the depot erupted into chaos. Guards rushed toward the sound of gunfire, exactly as Mitchell had planned. That's when he led his team down the nearly vertical hillside, using ropes and sheer determination to descend what the enemy had thought was impassable terrain. They hit the depot's north side like a hammer. The few guards there were so focused on the firefight to the east that Mitchell's team was inside the perimeter before anyone realized what was happening. What followed was 8 minutes of controlled chaos. Mitchell's men moved through the depot with practiced efficiency, securing buildings, neutralizing resistance, and most importantly, identifying supplies. What they found exceeded their wildest hopes. Crates of ammunition, not just for enemy weapons, but also captured American munitions from earlier battles. Medical supplies, including morphine, bandages, and antibiotics. Even some food rations. But there was something else, something that made Mitchell's blood run cold. In one of the buildings, they found documents, maps showing enemy positions, attack plans, and most critically, confirmation that Firebase Echo wasn't just going to be attacked. It was the first target in a massive offensive plan to push American forces back 50 miles. The attack was scheduled for dawn, just 2 hours away. Mitchell made a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life. They couldn't just take supplies and leave. They had to destroy this depot completely, deny the enemy these resources for their offensive, and they had to do it in the next few minutes before enemy reinforcements arrived. He ordered his men to plant every explosive they had, while simultaneously loading trucks with the supplies they needed. It was a race against time, and Mitchell knew that every second they spent here increased the risk exponentially. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are telling it, hit that subscribe button, because we've got dozens more forgotten American hero stories that deserve to be heard. The extraction was where everything nearly fell apart. As Mitchell's team loaded the last of the critical supplies, they heard the unmistakable sound of trucks approaching. Enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than anticipated. Thompson's diversion team was already falling back under heavy fire. Martinez's perimeter team was engaged on two sides. Mitchell had maybe 90 seconds before they'd be completely surrounded. He made the call. They'd take 2 captured trucks loaded with supplies and fight their way out. Everyone else would have to move on foot through the mountains. It meant leaving behind some of the supplies they'd fought for, but it was better than losing everything, including their lives. The explosives were set on a 5-minute fuse. That gave them just enough time to clear the kill zone. Private Rodriguez, the kid from Texas, who'd been so nervous hours earlier, volunteered to stay behind to ensure the charges went off properly. Mitchell refused. He wouldn't ask any of his men to take a risk he wouldn't take himself, but Rodriguez was insistent, pointing out that he was the best with explosives in the unit, and someone needed to make sure they actually detonated. Before Mitchell could argue, Sergeant Thompson stepped in with a compromise. They'd all leave together, but they'd cut the fuses shorter to 3 minutes. It was risky, but it gave them a fighting chance. The convoy broke through the enemy perimeter in a blaze of gunfire. One truck took multiple hits, but kept moving. Men hung off the sides, firing their rifles at pursuing soldiers. The mountain road was barely wide enough for the vehicles, with a sheer drop on one side. Behind them, the depot erupted in a series of massive explosions that lit up the pre-dawn sky like a second sunrise. The blast was so powerful, it knocked some of Mitchell's men off their feet, even though they were already a quarter mile away. They'd done it. They'd pulled off what should have been an impossible mission. But as they raced back toward Firebase Echo, Mitchell knew the real test was still ahead. They reached Firebase Echo just as the sun was breaking over the mountains. The men they'd left behind cheered when they saw the trucks rolling in loaded with supplies. Mitchell immediately ordered the ammunition distributed and defensive positions reinforced. They had maybe 30 minutes before the enemy attack began. The intelligence documents they'd captured showed the attack plan in detail. The enemy would hit them with artillery first, then wave assaults from 3 directions. It was a textbook offensive designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. But Mitchell now had 3 advantages they didn't know about. First, his men were resupplied with enough ammunition to actually sustain a fight. Second, he knew exactly where and when the attack was coming. Third, the enemy had just lost their major supply depot, which meant their offensive wouldn't have the logistical support it needed. Mitchell repositioned his defenses based on the captured intelligence. He concentrated his machine guns where the documents showed the main assault would come. He placed his best marksmen in positions overlooking the approach routes. He even had his mortars pre-sighted on the exact coordinates where enemy forces would stage their assault. When the attack came at 0600 hours, it was every bit as fierce as predicted. Artillery shells rained down on Firebase Echo, sending geysers of mud and rock into the air. Then came the infantry. waves of soldiers moving up the slope toward American positions. But Mitchell's men were ready. The machine guns opened up with devastating effect. The mortars dropped shells with pinpoint accuracy. Every bullet counted because they knew exactly where to aim. For 3 hours, Charlie Company held against an enemy force that should have overrun them in minutes. They held because of Mitchell's unconventional raid. They held because of supplies taken from the enemy. They held because one captain had made an impossible decision. By mid-morning, the enemy offensive had stalled. They'd taken massive casualties trying to overrun Firebase Echo, and without their supply depot, they couldn't sustain the attack. Mitchell's company had suffered too, 7 men killed, 19 wounded. But they'd held the position and disrupted an entire enemy offensive. The reinforcements that were supposed to arrive days ago finally showed up just after noon. A full battalion with tanks, artillery, and fresh supplies. The crisis was over. Mitchell expected congratulations, maybe even a commendation. What he got instead was a summons to division headquarters. The tone of the message made it clear this wasn't about celebrating a victory. 3 days later, Mitchell stood in front of a board of officers explaining his actions. The raid on the supply depot, while successful, had been conducted without authorization. He'd split his forces in violation of his orders to hold the position. He'd used captured enemy supplies, which raised questions about adherence to protocols. Most damning, some of the documents they'd captured had been damaged in the firefight, and headquarters wanted to know what intelligence might have been lost. Mitchell laid out his reasoning calmly and clearly. He explained the ammunition situation, the overwhelming enemy numbers, and the split-second decisions required in combat. He showed how the raid had not only saved his company, but had disrupted an entire enemy offensive. He provided testimony from his men about the supplies they'd captured and how those supplies had made the difference between holding and being overrun. The board listened in stony silence. Then came the verdict that shocked everyone in the room. Captain James Mitchell was not court-martialed. He was not reprimanded. Instead, he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action. But in the same ceremony where he received the medal, he was informed of his transfer. He would be reassigned stateside to a training command position, effective immediately. On paper, it was a promotion, a chance to shape the next generation of officers, to pass on his tactical knowledge and combat experience. In reality, everyone understood what it meant. The Army valued Mitchell's courage and success, but his willingness to bend rules and take unauthorized action made headquarters uncomfortable. He was being moved somewhere he couldn't make those kinds of independent decisions anymore. The men of Charlie Company were devastated. They'd followed Mitchell through hell and come out the other side because of his leadership. Now that leadership was being taken away, Sergeant Thompson, who'd served with Mitchell for 7 years across 2 wars, said it plainest. They were punishing success because it didn't fit the manual. Mitchell took his transfer orders without complaint. He understood the military's position even if he didn't agree with it. Chain of command, following orders, doing things by the book, these things mattered. You couldn't have every officer making their own rules, even when those improvised decisions worked out. But there was something deeper at play, something Mitchell would spend years thinking about. He'd made a choice in the fog of war, a choice that prioritized his men's lives over strict adherence to orders. That choice had worked, had saved lives, had accomplished the mission, but it set a precedent that made commanders nervous. What if the next officer, faced with an impossible situation, made a similar gamble and it failed catastrophically? Mitchell's final days in Korea were bittersweet. His men threw him an unofficial farewell, sharing stories and promising to stay in touch. Private Rodriguez, who'd wanted to stay behind at the depot, told Mitchell he was the best officer he'd ever served under. Martinez gave him a knife with the company insignia carved into the handle. Thompson simply shook his hand and said he'd follow him into hell again if ever asked. Mitchell returned to the United States in the spring of 1953, taking up his new position at Fort Benning, Georgia. He threw himself into training the next generation of Army officers, teaching tactics, leadership, and the realities of combat. But he was careful now. He taught by the book, followed every regulation, never encouraged the kind of creative thinking that had saved Charlie Company. Some of his students sensed there was more to him than what he showed in the classroom. The silver star on his uniform suggested stories he never told. Occasionally, someone would ask about Korea, and Mitchell would give textbook answers about leadership principles and tactical doctrine. He never talked about Firebase Echo, the impossible raid, or the decision that defined his career. Years passed. Mitchell rose steadily through the ranks, always competent, always professional, always playing it safe. He made colonel, then eventually retired after 25 years of service. He settled in a small town in Virginia, married a school teacher named Ellen, and tried to live a quiet life. But Firebase Echo never really left him. Sometimes at night he'd wake up thinking about that decision. What if the raid had failed? What if more of his men had died? What if the intelligence had been wrong and there'd been nothing at that depot? The what-ifs haunted him more than the firefights. In the late 1970s, Mitchell received a letter from Sergeant Thompson. Charlie Company was having a reunion, and they wanted their captain there. Mitchell almost didn't go. It had been 25 years. These men had moved on with their lives, and so had he. But Ellen convinced him, saying some ghosts needed to be faced directly. The reunion was held at a VFW hall in Ohio. When Mitchell walked in, the room went silent for a moment, then erupted in cheers. These weren't young soldiers anymore. They were middle-aged men with gray hair, expanding waistlines, and the weight of decades of civilian life on their shoulders. But when they looked at Mitchell, he saw the same trust and respect he'd seen on that frozen ridge in Korea. They spent the weekend sharing stories, remembering fallen comrades, and trying to explain to their families what they'd been through together. On the last night, Thompson pulled Mitchell aside. He told him something that had never made it into the official reports. After Mitchell had been transferred, Charlie Company had been involved in 17 more major engagements before the armistice. Their casualty rate in those engagements was 3 times higher than it had been under Mitchell's command. The officers who'd replaced him were good men, competent commanders, but they played by the book. They didn't take the kinds of risks Mitchell had taken, and men died because of it. Thompson wasn't saying this to make Mitchell feel guilty. He was saying it to make him understand something important. That decision at Firebase Echo, the one that got him transferred, had established a culture in Charlie Company. A culture of creative problem-solving, of trusting their leaders to make hard choices, of understanding that sometimes the book doesn't have the right answer. That culture had kept men alive even after Mitchell left. His legacy wasn't just in what he'd done, but in what he'd taught them about thinking for themselves. Mitchell spent the drive home thinking about Thompson's words. He'd spent 25 years wondering if he'd made the right choice, if the transfer had been a punishment or a message. Now he understood it had been neither. It had been the price of leadership. Real leadership sometimes meant making choices that made people uncomfortable, that challenged the system, that prioritized the immediate mission and the men carrying it out over institutional preferences. In the years that followed, Mitchell became something he never expected. Young officers, hearing about Firebase Echo through the informal networks that exist in every military, would seek him out. They'd visit his home in Virginia, ostensibly to pay respects to a retired colonel, but really to hear the story, to understand how you make decisions when the manual doesn't cover your situation. Mitchell was careful in these conversations. He never encouraged insubordination or recklessness, but he did teach something important. He taught that leadership meant taking responsibility for decisions made in impossible circumstances. That following orders was crucial, but so was understanding the intent behind those orders. That a good officer protects their men while accomplishing the mission, and sometimes those two things require creativity. One young captain told Mitchell something that crystallized everything. He said that in the army, they teach you tactics and strategy, logistics and operations. But nobody teaches you how to live with the weight of decisions made in the chaos of combat. Nobody teaches you that the hardest part isn't making the decision, it's living with it afterward, wondering if you did the right thing. Mitchell realized then that his transfer hadn't been punishment. It had been protection. The army had recognized something about him. He was an officer who would always prioritize his men, who would bend rules if necessary, who couldn't be relied upon to always follow the script. That made him dangerous in the traditional command structure. But it also made him valuable as a teacher, as someone who could prepare the next generation for the reality of leadership. Mitchell passed away in 2003 at the age of 83. His funeral was attended by dozens of men from Charlie Company, now old themselves but still bound by what they'd shared on that Korean ridge 50 years earlier. They told stories about their captain, about the impossible raid, about the decision that saved their lives and ended his combat career. The story of Captain James Mitchell isn't really about that one decision in Korea. It's about the cost of leadership and the price of doing what you believe is right, even when the system tells you there's a proper way to do things. Mitchell made a choice that saved 87 lives, disrupted an enemy offensive, and accomplished his mission. That choice also marked him as someone who couldn't be trusted to always color inside the lines. The military needs both kinds of leaders. It needs the ones who follow the book and maintain order and discipline, but it also needs the ones who understand that real combat doesn't follow the book, that soldiers' lives are more valuable than regulations, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in facing the enemy, but in facing the consequences of doing what you know is right. Every military has stories like Mitchell's, heroes whose actions saved lives but made commanders uncomfortable. They're often transferred, sidelined, or quietly moved away from combat commands, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways the institution wasn't prepared for. These are the forgotten heroes, the ones who made impossible decisions in impossible situations and then paid the price for getting it right in the wrong way. Captain James Mitchell held Firebase Echo with 87 men against 1,500 enemy soldiers. He conducted an unauthorized raid that captured critical intelligence and supplies. He disrupted an entire enemy offensive and saved countless American lives. And for that, he was given a medal and transferred stateside, spending the rest of his career teaching others while never again leading men in combat. Was it fair? Maybe not. Was it necessary? Perhaps. Was it the price of leadership? Absolutely. The next time you hear about a military hero, remember that heroism isn't always rewarded with continued opportunity. Sometimes it's rewarded with a medal and a quiet transfer. Sometimes the price of saving your men is never getting to lead men in combat again. And sometimes the truest measure of a hero isn't in what they did, but in how they carried the weight of that decision for the rest of their lives, without regret, without bitterness, knowing they'd made the choice their conscience demanded, even when it cost them everything they'd worked for. Captain James Mitchell was transferred after a single horrifying decision. But that decision defined what real American heroism looks like when nobody's watching, when the cameras are off, and when doing the right thing means sacrificing your own career for the men who trusted you to bring them home. That's the story they never told, until now.